Okay, everybody, this is Kevin Lockett once again. Today we have a distinguished individual. All my guests are distinguished, but this guy is really distinguished. Michael E. Mann, climate change scientist, professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and author of the book, Our Fragile Moment. How are you today, sir?
Thanks, Kevin. It's great to be with you. Doing okay.
That's good. So I'm a pop culture junkie. I believe there's climate change. I believe we need to do stuff for the environment. But you did something that I enjoy in the book. I am a sucker for a good dystopian movie. So, Blade Runner was supposed to be in 2019. Soylent Green was supposed to be in 2022.
Right.
And you used one of my favorite movies of all time, Planet of the Apes, to help you discuss climate change. What made you decide to infuse those two things, popular culture, with climate change for people?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'm, a product of my youth, of the 1970s and the 1980s. And it's just sort of natural for me to try to work in, those elements from my past, because I think it sort of adds to the storytelling, the narrative sort of approach to talking about this massive problem, the climate crisis. If I can pull people in through some interesting stories, some, popular culture references that they might be able to sort of grab onto, then that's great. And I enjoy writing about that. So, and there are all of these remarkable cautionary tales. In the early 1970s, there were all these dystopian films that really, I think, were an expression of us. It wasn't a coincidence that this was happening at the same time that there was this emergence of understanding of the environmental crises that we have created and that we were facing. And so, I think it speaks to that. These dystopian films, Planet of the Apes, Soylent Green, Omega Man, there were so many of them, Silent Running, Logan's Run, I could go on and on. It spoke to the fact that we were coming to grips with sort of the fragility. And of course, that's the title of the book is This Fragile Moment. And it was really in the 1970s when we were starting to come to grips with the fragility of our existence on this planet. And climate change, of course, has emerged as the defining crisis that we face. But, Soylent Green was premised back in 1973. That film was premised on future global warming. So it was remarkably prescient. Who would have thought that Charlton Heston would be sort of a prophet of environmental degradation? But in essence, he was.
Right. So I'm not sure if you had this in the book or not, because I'm just tearing through it. The Canadian fires happened over the summer. And I live in Ohio, and it was interesting to me because they really didn't talk about the Canadian fires that much. They just said it was just happening. But as the summer went along, we got smoke from the Canadian fires down in Ohio, and it kept reaching down the south. I thought Canada was safe because when you look at California, I kind of figured, okay, before this year, when it's all this rain, you had drought, you had heat. I kind of understood the wildfires out there. What's causing the fires in Canada, and why was the smoke billowing down to places like Ohio, which is not even close to Canada?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it was a late development. The book had already gone to press by the time that happened. But I do talk about this rash of extreme weather events that we've faced around the planet, but certainly here in the United States. And so that is part of the discussion. And this was the latest example of that. These wildfires were, a product of extreme drought in Canada. And that is something that we expect. That's something the models predict, that we see worsened drought. It isn't just in the Western US, which, this arid region of the country, but even other regions, of North America, like Canada, are becoming increasingly prone to climate-driven drought. And you take heat and drought and you put them together and you get these massive wildfires. Here in Philadelphia, where I live, we experienced the worst air quality in the world for several days this summer because of that wildfire smoke. And, it is an interesting question. Why was it coming down into the United States? Well, the jet stream is getting weaker as we warm up the planet. We're warming the polar regions more than we are the tropics, and that's changing the strength of the jet stream. And a slower jet stream means you're more likely to get sort of meandering waves in the atmosphere and sort of winds coming from directions that we wouldn't normally expect, coming from the north or coming from the east, rather than the typical sort of westward flow that we expect with the jet stream. And so, or westerly flow, eastward flow that we expect for the jet stream. Instead, we've seen winds coming from the east or from the north. And that's unusual, and climate change is helping create those unusual atmospheric circulation patterns. So it was really those things that combined that gave us this unprecedented air quality problem here, again, in places where we don't expect it, like, we don't expect to have to deal with, wildfire smoke here in Philadelphia, and yet we were. And same thing with you in Ohio.
All right. Speaking of warming, one of the things that really concerns me, and we don't talk about this enough, are the oceans. The oceans continue to warm. Hurricane season wasn't too terrible this year compared to the years past, even though California almost had a hurricane, which is almost
careful. It's not done yet. It could have another surprise or two in store for us.
As of right now, we're still in it. You have sharks coming in because the waters are wider. The waters are warmer, so they're biting people. What can be done to cool the oceans? Because we always talk about it's getting warmer, but what can it be done to reverse that trend?
Yeah, 90% of the heating from human greenhouse warming is going into the oceans. So that's really where much of the heat is accumulating, and the oceans are getting warmer and warmer. As you note, that has all sorts of implications because hurricanes, the process that produces and strengthens hurricanes, intensifies them, is the heating from the warm oceans and the energy that comes from that. And one of the most robust findings in climate science today is the finding that hurricanes, we expect them to get more intense. We expect to see more of those superstorms, those Category 5, or we might even have to, create a new Category 6, given the increasing intensity of the hurricanes that we're seeing. It's something we predicted long ago, and it's something we see in the observations. And it's not like a subtle signal that we have to carefully discern from the observations. We're seeing that every 1 degree Celsius, better part of 2 degree Fahrenheit warming of the ocean surface means a roughly 14% larger, 14% increase in the maximum sustained winds of these very strong storms, which translates to a nearly 50% increase in the intensity and the destructive potential of those storms. A 50% increase isn't a small, subtle signal. It's something we see, something we feel. And then there's the flooding. Here, once again, I'll talk about Philadelphia. Hurricane Ida 2 years ago came through Philadelphia, dumped out record amounts of rainfall over a 24-hour period. And part of why we saw so much rainfall was that the Gulf of Mexico was so warm that put much more moisture into the storm when it formed. And it kept that moisture, it brought it with it, and it dumped it out on the East Coast in Philadelphia and New York City. So yes, we are seeing the direct consequences of this warming, and it's not subtle anymore. We are seeing profound impacts.
Carl Sagan, you talk about this, discuss Carl Sagan in your book. He impacted you a lot. How does Carl Sagan impact you as a climate scientist, and also what was his impact while you was writing the book?
Yeah, and I would say, his legacy, we still see the legacy of Carl Sagan today. The great Neil deGrasse Tyson, foremost climate science communicator today, actually was directly influenced by Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan invited him up from New York to visit with him at Cornell University when he was a high school student, a promising young high school student. And I think that interaction, in fact, there's a great, in Neil deGrasse Tyson's remake of the Cosmos series, the original Carl Sagan Cosmos series, they actually get out Carl Sagan's old appointment book. And you see the whole day was crossed out and it just had Neil Tyson written in. He was going to spend the whole time talking to this, the inner city kid who showed signs of brilliance. And now Neil is sort of one of our Carl Sagans today, along with my good friend Bill Nye, and Bill was directly influenced by him as well. Bill went studied engineering at Cornell, took a class with Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan encouraged him to go in the direction that he did, sort of science, popularization, and communication. And certainly Sagan had an influence on me. I grew up watching Cosmos when I was in, I think, junior high, early high school. And it inspired me. It's like, wow, there are these amazing questions about our world and our universe. And you can spend your life studying them and trying to learn about, our place on this planet and our place in the universe. So yeah, it was formative for me. And it just happens that I went into the field of climate science. My sort of circuitous path of studies eventually led me to do my PhD in climate science and geosciences with an emphasis on climate modeling. And as it happens, Carl Sagan did some of the critical early work on climate. For example, the faint young sun paradox. How is it that the Earth wasn't a frozen planet 4 billion years ago? And we know it wasn't frozen because there were liquid oceans teeming with microbes. Why wasn't it frozen when the sun was 30% dimmer than it is today? You do the calculations, it should have been a frozen planet. It wasn't, and Sagan realized it must mean there was a stronger greenhouse effect. And indeed, we now understand that's the case. And so there's so much we can learn from the past. As the sun got brighter, the planet didn't continue to get warmer and warmer because the greenhouse effect actually got lower over time in just such a way that the temperature of the planet stayed within habitable bounds. And that probably wasn't a coincidence either. It ties into the Gaia hypothesis formulated by the great scientist James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, Carl Sagan's one-time life partner. So it all gets very incestuous. They sort of expanded upon what Sagan had found with the faint early sun paradox, and they realized that there must be something about the Earth that keeps the temperature within habitable bounds, even as the sun was getting brighter. And it turns out life itself, participating in the global carbon cycle, helped decrease the greenhouse effect to keep the planet cool enough for life. So there are these amazing stabilizing forces in the climate, and that's a good thing. But if you hit the system too hard, and we see evidence of that in the paleoclimate record as well, it can spin out of control. And so the question is, where are we today? Are we part of that those stabilizing forces and factors, or are we going to act as the destabilizing factor? And unfortunately, we're on a course where if we don't change, we will be that destabilizing factor.
Like you mentioned before, you had Carl Sagan as far as Cosmos watching TV. What's the best way of educating kids about climate? Because as the adults, we should be the smartest people in the room. But a lot of people are not listening, so it might be on the kids to fix things. So what's the best way to educate kids when it comes to climate?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll tell you that the kids are pretty educated. I teach them here, not so much kids, but they're still in their like 18, 19, the first year students here at Penn. But my daughter is in high school. Her friends, this sort of Gen Z, they're pretty good. They get it. They're pretty savvy. They're pretty smart. They're incredibly articulate, and they understand the dimensions of the challenges that they face and the crises that they face. And I think they realize that if they don't take action themselves, nobody else is going to. They've got to sort of take hold of the steering wheel here because they are going to inherit this planet. It's important for us to make sure that their efforts aren't in vain because they're not yet in a position to make those decisions, to influence policy in the way that we can. So we have to provide them the opportunity. We have to make sure that we don't squander the opportunity for them in the meantime by continuing down this profligate road of ongoing burning of fossil fuels and the warming of the planet and the destabilization of our climate that's causing. There's still time to make sure that we don't, destabilize the climate, that we don't warm the planet beyond habitable bounds. And so it's absolutely critical over the next decade or so, we've got to bring carbon emissions down by 50% to prevent a warming of more than 3 degrees Fahrenheit, where we'll really start to see the worst and truly permanent consequences of the climate crisis. We can still do it, but we've got to decrease carbon emissions 50%. Within this decade, that means we need massive incentives. We need policies that will move us quickly in that direction. And that means we've got to turn out and vote for politicians who will support those policies and vote out the politicians who are standing in the way.
What type of policy you think would be, let's say we vote people out who don't care. And what type of policy, if they talk to you, say, hey, what policies should we enact to kind of reverse things right now? What would you say?
I would say I don't want to be too prescriptive, because I'm not, that's the role of policymakers. They're elected for that purpose. But those policies have to be informed by an honest assessment of the risks. And too many of our politicians, unfortunately, on one side of the aisle today deny that climate change is even real. I'm talking about the Republican Party. It is almost become orthodoxy within the party that the climate crisis is either a hoax or it's not really a crisis. It's not really a problem. And that's obviously problematic. So what do we need? We need policies that will move us in the right direction. What form should that take? Should it be like a carbon tax or a revenue neutral carbon tax or a cap and trade system or a clean energy standard that requires utilities to provide an increasing share of electricity from renewables? There are lots of different ways to try to level the playing field, right? Because right now we're providing too many incentives, subsidies to the fossil fuel industry for energy that's hurting the planet and not doing the same thing for clean energy. We've got our thumb collectively on the wrong end of the scale. So we have to level the playing field so that renewable energy can compete fairly, that energy that isn't degrading our environment and our climate can compete fairly in the marketplace. And there are lots of ways to do that. And I'm happy to leave it to the politicians to debate, what those policies should look like. There are lots of options, but the bottom line is they have to address the crisis. They have to allow the science to inform those policies, and they do have to act, and they have to act quickly. And we have to act by getting rid of those politicians who fail to.
Right. In your research, is there a city or state or even country that we should mirror, that we should say, hey, they're doing it the right way here? So it could be an American city that we don't know. It could be a country just they figure it out and they're just moving along when it comes to climate change.
Yeah, well, here in Philadelphia, we've got a great mayor, and the former mayor Nutter prioritized, climate resilience, and we have all sorts of environmental justice issues and climate justice issues. Those with the least wealth are most likely to live in the flood-prone regions or the hot spots for summer heat waves, and so we need to provide assistance to those folks to help them cope and deal with the consequences that we're already seeing. So here in Philadelphia, I feel like we're doing a pretty good job. We've got pretty enlightened leadership when it comes to the climate crisis. Pennsylvania at the state level isn't doing as much as it could be doing. And, other states like California are really leading the way. California has demonstrated that you can grow the economy and cut carbon emissions at the same time if you have the right policies. And they have policies to incentivize clean energy and disincentivize fossil fuel energy, but they also have policies that increase energy efficiency. And in fact, a major factor in California's ability to cut their emissions has actually been low-hanging fruit, just energy conservation measures. And so there's so much that we can do. California is I think is sort of setting a standard for the rest of the states to follow. I would certainly like to see my state of Pennsylvania raise their game, and there are a lot of other states that need to raise their game as well. Because if the United States collectively doesn't do its part, the rest of the world isn't going to come to the table either. We've got to lead on this issue because we've put more carbon pollution into the atmosphere collectively than any other country, and that means if we don't lead on this, then why should anyone else, right? If the United States isn't taking leadership on a problem that they've contributed more to than anyone else, then it really provides an excuse to the Chinas and the Indias of the world to not do as much as they should do. So that's why American leadership is so important. And once again, our ability to elect leaders who will act. And voting is part of it. We've got to vote in every election, and all the way down from, president to dog catcher, and vote on climate. But we've got to use our voice. We've got to make sure others are aware of the challenges we face, that others turn out, that others vote, and we can organize. We can support organizations that that lobby Congress to pass environmentally friendly policies. There's so many things we can do as individuals, but the most important thing is to work together collectively to put pressure on policymakers to do the things that we can't do as individuals, to create the incentives that we know we need in our economy.
Leonardo DiCaprio played a version of you in the movie Don't Look Up. Now, you didn't
not
get
as good looking, but otherwise.
Yeah, who's like,
yeah, I know,
you're so unattractive.
I know.
But you didn't get into this to have a film inspired by you or things like. But what does that feel like that that some of your work is inspiring people to say, hey, we need to kind of do more to kind of get people into the seats to see, like, hey, we have to get a hold of this climate change.
Well, it was very kind of Leonardo DiCaprio, Leo, as they call him, to name check me in an interview, and he was asked who inspired that character, and I wasn't quite sure how to take it, because while the character has in the film has some positive attributes, in the end, he plays a heroic role. He's got some real flaws, marital infidelity, not the least of them, and so my wife was like, "Wait a second." And it's funny. I actually watched the film. I had an early advanced viewing of the film, and we were watching it. We had a code to watch it on our home television, and we're watching it. And my daughter actually said, like, this is before Leo had said anything, "Dad, I think he's trying to be like you," just because of like his nervous tics or whatever, his like mannerisms. But there's an important point here. I mean, Leo has really done a lot to try to raise public awareness, and he gets criticized for flying or what have you. It's easy to try to criticize somebody for a lifestyle that they're sort of stuck with, as a major celebrity. But he has used his platform more than almost anyone else I can think of to really raise awareness about the climate crisis. And in fact, the most Googled, so the greatest incidence of people Googling the terms global warming or climate change was during or right after his Academy Awards acceptance speech some years ago, where he used his acceptance speech to talk about the climate crisis. So he's a hero to me. I'm honored that he would even mention my name when he was talking about the inspiration for the character. But more than anything else, opinion leaders, celebrities, influentials can help us reach a larger audience. Not everybody wants to listen to what an ivory-towered pinhead academic scientist like me has to say. But if you can get Taylor Swift to be talking about this, or Beyonce, or any, of these sort of people who have huge platforms, they can use that. They can use that platform. And that's an important, we can try to encourage them. We can try to put a little bit of pressure on them to do that. I think Taylor Swift, my daughter's a huge Swiftie, but I would love to see Taylor Swift use her platform to talk more about the climate crisis.
So outside of voting, because for Gen Z, they have TikTok and all these things, so they're doing a lot of stuff to kind of get people informed. But for people who are Gen X, outside of voting, what things can they do to help the climate, to help the environment, just to do their part?
Yeah, I mean, Gen Xers, we can vote, obviously, but we can use our voice, right? Part of what climate deniers and polluters have tried to do is to sort of chill the public discourse about climate change. They want to make it controversial. They want you to think that your friends and neighbors are climate deniers. It's actually a very small percentage, maybe 10% of the public are hardcore dismissives, as we call them. There's public survey work that shows that. But we think that there are many more climate deniers out there among us because the fossil fuel industry and the conservative media have done such a good job in amplifying climate denialism and climate contrarianism. And when they do that, when we're afraid that, hey, our friends, our neighbors, our classmates, hey, who knows, they might be climate deniers, we're afraid to broach the topic. And so it chills the discourse. We're not talking about it. If we're not talking about it, then there isn't pressure on politicians to do something about it. And so it all comes down, in the end, to our individual behavior, no question. but how we as individuals can impact others, organizations, politicians, the political process, through our voice, through our vote, through every means we have available to us. And again, as Gen Xers, the Gen Zers, most of them can't vote yet. The young folks can't vote yet. They're not yet in a position to impact directly the policies that are going to have huge consequences for them down the road. So we have to make sure that we act as their surrogates. We act on their behalf when we vote, when we turn out to vote. We're not just voting for ourselves. We're voting for our children and our grandchildren and future generations.
All right, Michael E. Mann, thank you for the conversation. Please tell us why we should read Our Fragile Moment.
No, because it's the best book ever written, of course. No, you know what? It is a defining moment. We are at that fragile moment where it's not too late to act. But as I explain in the book, it's not too late to act. And our a study of 4 billion years of Earth history tells us that there is a certain amount of resilience in the climate system. We're not yet beyond that point of no return. So there is urgency, no question about it. We see the urgency. We're already seeing climate-driven catastrophes, but there's agency. It's not too late to do something about it. And that's what my review of Earth history, I think, convincingly tells us. And so I hope folks will check it out. There are a lot of interesting stories, a lot of fun stories, in fact. So I think it's a fun read. It's an enjoyable read, and you'll learn quite a bit about our predicament and about our ability to still do something about it.
What's the most interesting story in the book that you like to share?
Oh, it's a great question. I would say it is the Silurian hypothesis, the possibility that sentient reptile people were responsible for a global warming episode 56 million years ago. You might gather there's a little bit of sci-fi going on there, but it's an interesting thought experiment. What if that did happen? There was a burst of warming 56 million years ago. Scientists have been trying to figure out how it happened for years. And so it's an interesting thought experiment. Well, what if there was an intelligent civilization of lizard people 56 million years? How would we know? What would be the evidence they left behind? And what could we learn from what had happened then? And so I think that story is fun because it gets into a lot of interesting popular culture references, like the series Land of the Lost that I watched as a kid, which was about sort of an ancient civilization of that sort. Science fiction writers have actually been thinking about that for decades. People like Isaac Asimov wrote short stories about what if there was an intelligent, we're always asking, are there intelligent civilizations out there, on other planets, in other solar systems? Without stopping to ask the question, is it possible there was an intelligent civilization before on Earth? And how would we know? And what would we learn from the clues that they left behind? So that would be, if I had to pick one thing, it would be that discussion in, I believe that is chapter 3.
Okay.
No, chapter 5. Chapter 5.
And chapter 4 has the pop culture stuff as far as like Planet of the Apes and all that stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it was a fun book to write, but with a message that I think really is, resonates with where we are at this very moment.
I think it's an important message because I think sometimes we get away from this stuff. We're experiencing these things now weather-wise, and it's never too late to fix it.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. Thanks a lot, Mr. Mann.
Thank you. It was great talking with you, Kevin.
Great talking to you.